The bridge of the human dreadnought times, Defiant Horizon times, was quiet when the transmission arrived. Admiral Sarah Chen sat in her command chair, reviewing supply reports from the new colonies in the Kepler frontier. Her crew worked at their stations with the calm efficiency that came from years of service together. Outside the reinforced windows, stars stretched endlessly in all directions, and 3 human colony worlds orbited peacefully in the distance. The communications officer suddenly straightened in her seat. "Admiral, we're receiving a priority transmission. Unknown origin. But the signal strength is massive." Chen looked up from her datapad. "Put it through." The main view screen flickered to life, and everyone on the bridge stopped what they were doing. The image that appeared was unlike anything most of them had seen before. A being made of what looked like living crystal stood before them, its body refracting light into rainbow patterns. Its face, if it could be called that, had no eyes or mouth, yet somehow radiated an expression of cold superiority. "I am Herald Zephanus, of the Galactic Sovereignty," the being announced. Its voice came through the speakers with perfect clarity, though Chen noticed its crystalline mouth never moved. Some kind of telepathic translation, she guessed. "You are the humans of Earth, correct?" Chen stood from her chair and walked closer to the screen. "I'm Admiral Sarah Chen, commanding officer of the Terran Defense Fleet, Kepler Sector. To whom am I speaking?" The crystalline being seemed to shimmer with what might have been amusement. "Your question reveals your ignorance. The Galactic Sovereignty is the supreme authority in this region of space. We have maintained order and peace among civilized species for 3,000 of your years. Your presence in the Kepler frontier has been noted and evaluated." "Noted and evaluated," Chen repeated slowly. She glanced at her second-in-command, Commander Marcus Rodriguez, who raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting way to start a conversation." "This is not a conversation," Herald Zephanus said. "This is a formal notification of sovereignty law. You have violated Protocol 17 by establishing colonies in disputed territory. You have violated Protocol 9 by refusing to register your species with the Central Authority. You have violated Protocol 43 by developing weapons technology without proper oversight." Chen crossed her arms. "We didn't know about any of these protocols. This is our first contact with your organization. Ignorance is not an excuse," the Herald continued. "The protocols have existed for millennia. All species are expected to comply upon reaching interstellar capability. The Galactic Sovereignty has reviewed your case and determined the appropriate response." Around the bridge, Chen's crew exchanged looks. The tactical officer, a young woman named Lieutenant Yuki Tanaka, quietly brought up defensive systems on her console. Chen noticed, but didn't acknowledge it. "Good instincts." Herald Zephanus raised what might have been a hand. "The sovereignty requires the following actions within 48 of your hours. First, you will cease all expansion activities immediately. All construction on your colony worlds will stop. Second, you will surrender administrative control of 3 of your colony worlds to sovereignty management. These worlds will serve as tribute and demonstration of your compliance. Third, you will accept vassal status under sovereignty law. Your species will be assigned a guardian civilization to oversee your development. Fourth, you will provide complete technical documentation of all your weapon systems, ship designs, and military capabilities." The bridge had gone completely silent. Chen could feel the tension rising among her crew. She kept her voice level. "And if we refuse?" "Refusal is not anticipated," the Herald said. "In the 3,000 years of sovereignty administration, 47 species have received this ultimatum. All 47 complied within the specified time frame. The alternative to compliance is annihilation. The sovereignty maintains the largest military force in known space. Resistance would be brief and absolute." Chen stared at the screen for a long moment. She looked at the crystalline being, with its confident posture and its complete certainty. She thought about the words it had used: vassal status, tribute, surrender. She thought about the 3 colony worlds it demanded, where 15 million humans had built homes and lives and futures. Then, she started laughing. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a nervous giggle. It was a full, genuine laugh that echoed through the bridge. Commander Rodriguez looked at her in surprise. Then a slow grin spread across his face. Lieutenant Tanaka covered her mouth, shoulders shaking. Within seconds, the entire bridge crew was laughing, the tension breaking like a dam. Harold Zephinus tilted its crystalline head. "Explain your reaction." Chen wiped her eyes, still chuckling. I'm sorry. It's just... You're really doing this? The whole surrender or die speech? You actually think that's going to work? It has worked 47 times previously," the herald said. Its voice carried the first hint of confusion. "Yeah, well, you're about to make it 47 out of 48, Chen said. She walked right up to the view screen, looking directly at the alien being. "Let me explain something about humans, Herald. We're the species that looked at fire and decided to carry it around. We're the species that looked at wild wolves and turned them into pets. We looked at the ocean and built ships. We looked at the sky and built planes. We looked at space itself, the vacuum that wants to kill us in 100 different ways, and we said, I can work with this." The herald's crystalline body seemed to dim slightly. "Your point? My point is that you're threatening the wrong species," Chen said. "You want us to give up our colonies?" 3. Those are worlds where humans fought through equipment failures, supply shortages, and hostile environments to build something new. You want us to accept vassal status? We're the species that spent most of our history fighting wars against ourselves, just to avoid being controlled by each other. You think a strongly worded letter from some empire we've never heard of is going to make us kneel? Your defiance is noted," Harold Zephinus said. "However, it is illogical. Your species has existed in space for less than a century. The sovereignty has existed for 3 millennia. Your fleet consists of primitive vessels with limited capability. Our fleet has pacified entire sectors. Mathematical analysis shows your survival probability at 0.003%, Chen smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "You know what humans say about those odds? We say they're better than 0. That's good enough to try." Commander Rodriguez stepped forward. "Admiral, permission to speak freely?" "Granted," Chen said. "Harold Zephinus," Rodriguez said, addressing the screen. "I notice you mentioned 47 species that complied with your ultimatum. I'm curious about something. How many of those species had nuclear weapons when they were still living on a single planet? How many of them had world wars? How many of them developed weapons specifically designed to destroy their own civilization?" The herald paused. "Such development is rare. Most species achieve interstellar travel through cooperation, not conflict." "That's what I thought," Rodriguez said. "So you've never dealt with a species like us before? A species that's been fighting itself for thousands of years. A species that invented the concept of mutually assured destruction and lived under that threat for decades without destroying itself. You're used to peaceful species that explore space because they want to learn and grow. We explored space because our planet was getting too small for all our arguments." Lieutenant Tanaka spoke up from her station. "Admiral, I'm picking up increased activity from the alien vessel. They're charging what looks like a weapons system. Are we being targeted?" Chen asked. "Negative," Tanaka replied. "It looks like a demonstration. They're aiming at that dead moon in the outer system." On the view screen, Harold Zephinus gestured. "Observe the consequence of defiance." The bridge crew watched as a beam of blue-white energy lanced from the herald's ship toward the distant moon. Even at this range, the devastation was visible. The moon's surface erupted in a cascade of explosions. When the weapon stopped firing, a crater, the size of a small continent, marked the moon's face. "That was fired at 30% capacity," the herald said. "The 7th Pacification Fleet carries 300 vessels with this capability and greater. They are being dispatched to your location. They will arrive in 7 of your days. You have until then to reconsider your response. Choose wisely. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the bridge in silence. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Chen turned to her crew. Tanaka, did we get good readings on that weapon? Yes, Admiral, the tactical officer replied. The energy signature is consistent with focused plasma technology. Very powerful, but the charging time was significant. Approximately 12 seconds between initialization and firing. 12 seconds, Chen repeated. Rodriguez, what's the cycle time on our main railguns? 3.2 seconds, Admiral, Rodriguez said with a slight smile. And we can fire all 6 simultaneously. Chen nodded slowly. Communications. I need you to send a priority message to Fleet Command on Earth. Full details of this encounter. Tell them to activate Protocol Omega. The communications officer's eyes widened. Protocol Omega was the full military mobilization of all human forces. It had never been activated before, not even during the worst of the colony wars. Admiral, are you certain? Completely certain, Chen said. She turned to look at the view screen, now showing empty space where the Herald's vessel had been. Also send a message to all colonies in the Kepler frontier. Tell them what's coming. Give them the option to evacuate if they want, but make sure they know we're not surrendering. We're not giving up their worlds. We're going to fight. Rodriguez stepped closer and lowered his voice. Sarah, you saw what that weapon did to the moon. They have 300 ships. We have maybe 70 in this sector. I know the numbers, Marcus, Chen said quietly. But what choice do we have? If we give in now, we're vassals forever. Humanity doesn't do well with masters. We tried that for thousands of years on Earth, and it always ended the same way. Revolution. Rebellion. War. Better to fight now when we have some chance than to fight later when they've taken everything from us. You really think we have a chance? Rodriguez asked. Chen looked around the bridge at her crew. They were young, most of them. None of them had been alive during the last major war on Earth. They'd grown up in the peaceful expansion period, when humanity was united in its push toward the stars. But she could see something in their eyes now, something ancient and familiar. Determination, stubbornness, the same quality that had driven humans to survive ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters throughout their entire history. Yes, she said finally. I think we have a chance. Not because we're stronger or more advanced, but because we're too stubborn to quit. Every other species they've threatened probably did the math and realized fighting was suicide. But humans? We're the species that does stupid, impossible things just to prove we can. We climbed mountains because they were there. We went to our own moon with computers less powerful than a modern calculator. We've survived things that should have killed us 100 times over. She raised her voice so the entire bridge could hear. The galactic sovereignty thinks they can threaten us into submission. They think we're just another species that will fold when faced with superior force. They have no idea what they're dealing with. They're about to learn that humans don't surrender. We adapt. We overcome. We win by refusing to lose. Lieutenant Tanaka stood up from her station. Orders, Admiral? Chen smiled. Prepare for war. And someone get me a line to the other colony worlds. If the sovereignty wants a fight, we'll give them one they'll remember for the next 3,000 years. As the crew burst into action, Chen looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, 300 alien warships were preparing to crush humanity. But somewhere else, on Earth and Mars, and hundreds of colony worlds, billions of humans were about to receive the news. She wondered what the sovereignty would think when they realized what they'd done. They hadn't just threatened humanity. They'd given humanity a reason to unite, a common enemy, and a challenge to overcome. The galactic sovereignty had issued a warning. The human fleet had laughed in defiance. Now came the hard part. Making sure that laugh wasn't the last sound humanity ever made. The 7th Pacification Fleet moved through hyperspace like a school of silver fish, 300 warships traveling in perfect formation. On the bridge of the flagship Times Eternal Victory Asterisk, Fleet Admiral Crothon studied the tactical display with 4 of his 6 eyes, while the other 2 monitored the crew. He was a Vrexian, a species that had served the sovereignty for over 1,000 years, and he had commanded the 7th Fleet for 200 of those years. In that time, he had never lost a battle. He had never even been challenged. Status report. Crothon rumbled in his deep voice. Hyperspace transit proceeding normally, his navigation officer reported. We will arrive at the human colony system in 6 hours, Admiral. Crothon nodded, his large reptilian head moving slowly. And the humans? Have they responded to the ultimatum? Intelligence reports indicate increased military activity across all human-controlled space, the communications officer said. Their fleet is concentrating in the Kepler frontier. No indication of retreat or surrender. Foolish, Crothon said, but expected. Harold Zephanus reported unusual behavior during first contact. The humans laughed at the ultimatum. Armaning. Lav. The bridge crew exchanged glances. Several officers made gestures of confusion, movements specific to their various species, but all conveying the same meaning. No species laughed when faced with sovereignty, power. Crothon's tactical officer, a thin insectoid named Zizix, approached with a datapad. Admiral, the Intelligence Division has compiled a comprehensive report on human civilization. You should review this before engagement. I've fought 40 species, Crothon said dismissively. What makes these humans special? Everything, sir, Zix replied, his mandibles clicking nervously. The Intelligence Division has marked this report as Priority Alpha. They recommend extreme caution. That got Crothon's attention. Priority Alpha was reserved for significant threats, and the Intelligence Division didn't issue such warnings lightly. He took the datapad and began reading. As he scrolled through the report, his expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something approaching concern. The report began with basic information. Humans were a carbon-based species from a planet called Earth in a remote sector. They had reached interstellar capability only 70 years ago. Standard biology. No natural weapons or armor. No telepathic abilities. On the surface, they seemed like one of the weakest species the sovereignty had ever encountered. But the next section made Crothon pause. It was titled, Evolutionary Context. Humans evolved on a death world. That was the Intelligence Division's assessment. Earth was classified as a Type 7 hazard planet. With extreme weather variations, high gravity, aggressive predator species, and a rotation period that forced adaptation to dramatic temperature changes. Most intelligent species evolved on gentler worlds. The Vrexians came from a planet with stable climate and few predators. The crystalline heralds grew on planets with barely any gravity. The insectoid Zizix's species developed in underground colonies where conditions never changed. Humans evolved by surviving. Their planet tried to kill them constantly, and they adapted. They had no fur, so they learned to make clothing. They had no claws, so they made tools. They had no venom, so they developed weapons. Every disadvantage forced them to innovate. The report included a section on human warfare that made Crothon's scales itch. Humans had been fighting wars for their entire recorded history. Not occasional conflicts over resources, like most species experienced, but constant, brutal wars. Wars over territory, resources, ideology, religion, and sometimes for reasons no xenopsychologist could fully understand. They developed increasingly horrifying weapons. Clubs, swords, arrows, guns, bombs, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and finally nuclear weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization. They built weapons to destroy their own planet. Crothon read aloud. while they were still confined to one world? Yes, Admiral, Zizix confirmed. They developed planet-destroying weapons before they developed spaceflight. No other species in our records has done this. Most species consider such weapons unthinkable. Humans not only thought of them, but built thousands of them. Crothon continued reading. The next section covered human military doctrine, and it was deeply unsettling. Human warfare was built around the concept of total war. When humans fought, they committed everything. Their entire economy, their entire population, all their resources. Other species fought until the cost outweighed the benefit, then negotiated. Humans fought until they won, or until they were completely destroyed. The report included historical examples. A conflict called World War II had lasted 6 years and involved almost every nation on Earth. Over 60 million humans died, but they kept fighting. Another conflict called the Vietnam War lasted nearly 20 years. The Korean War technically never ended, frozen in a ceasefire that lasted decades. Humans didn't stop fighting. They sometimes paused, regrouped, and started again. They have a concept called Pyrrhic victory, Crothon read. Victory at such a high cost that it's almost indistinguishable from defeat. They have a word for this because it happens to them regularly, and they still consider it victory. Zeeks clicked his mandibles. The psychological profile suggests humans possess abnormally high levels of determination and what they call spite. They will continue fighting even when logic suggests surrender, sometimes purely to hurt their enemy. The report's section on human technology was equally disturbing. Human ships were primitive by sovereignty standards. Their weapons were crude, their power systems inefficient, their hull materials decades behind current technology. But their design philosophy was unlike anything the sovereignty had encountered. Most species designed ships to avoid damage. Heavy shields, fast engines, long-range weapons to strike from safety. Human ships were designed with the assumption that they would be damaged. They had redundant systems for everything. Multiple power cores, backup computer systems, compartmentalized sections that could be sealed off. Secondary control stations throughout the ship. A human vessel could lose half its systems and still function. Look at this, Crothon said, pointing to a schematic. This human destroyer has 14 separate power generators. Why would any ship need 14 generators? So that when 13 are destroyed, they still have power, Zeeks replied. Human military doctrine assumes catastrophic damage. They don't plan to avoid hits. They plan to survive them and keep fighting. The weapons section was simpler but no less concerning. Humans primarily used kinetic weapons, railguns that fired solid projectiles at extremely high velocities. Primitive, but effective. The projectiles were cheap to produce, required no special containment, and could be fired rapidly. More concerning were their missile systems. Human missiles had sophisticated guidance systems, could operate independently, and some variants could think and adapt to countermeasures. Crothon noticed a note at the bottom of the weapons section. Human weapons development appears to be driven by internal conflict rather than external threats. All major weapons systems were designed to fight other humans. Implications for combat doctrine are unclear but potentially significant. The final section of the report was titled Cultural Analysis, and it was the longest section. Crothon almost skipped it. What did human culture matter when plasma cannons were involved? But Zizix insisted he read it, so he continued. Humans had a concept called persistence hunting. Before they developed weapons, early humans hunted by chasing prey animals until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. Humans weren't fast, but they could run for hours, days even, following their prey until it was too tired to continue. This strategy was encoded in human psychology. They didn't give up. They didn't stop. They pursued goals with what the report called obsessive determination. This trait appeared throughout human culture. Their literature was filled with stories of underdogs defeating superior enemies through determination. Their sports celebrated athletes who fought through injury and exhaustion. Their most respected historical figures were often people who refused to quit despite overwhelming odds. Failure was acceptable in human culture. Giving up was not. They have hundreds of sayings about this, Crawthon read. Never give up. Never surrender. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Fall 7 times, stand up 8. It's not about how hard you hit. It's about how hard you can get hit and keep moving forward. Yes, Admiral. The psychological assessment suggests that surrender is culturally unacceptable for humans. Even when faced with certain defeat, human military forces typically fight to total destruction rather than capitulate. They have numerous historical examples of small forces fighting to the last soldier against overwhelming enemies. Crawthon set down the datapad and looked at the tactical display showing 300 sovereignty warships, the most powerful fleet in known space. He thought about the human fleet waiting for them, outnumbered and outgunned. By all logical analysis, the humans should surrender. They had to know they couldn't win. But logic didn't account for species that climbed mountains because they were there. Logic didn't account for species that developed world-destroying weapons while confined to one planet. Logic didn't account for species whose cultural identity was built around refusing to quit. Zeeks, Crawthon said slowly, your honest assessment. What are our chances? The insectoid tactical officer was silent for a moment. Mathematically, Admiral, we cannot lose. We outnumber them 4-1. Our technology is superior. Our weapons have greater range and power. The probability of our defeat is less than 1%. But, Crawthon prompted, hearing the hesitation. But the intelligence division notes that humans have won battles with worse odds multiple times throughout their history. And they've never faced an enemy from outside their planet before. Every war in their history was human versus human. This is their first war against aliens. The psychological profile suggests this may unite them in unprecedented ways. Crawthon stood and walked to the main view screen, looking at the streaking lights of hyperspace. He had served the sovereignty for 200 years. He had brought peace and order to dozens of systems. The sovereignty maintained its power through overwhelming force and the certainty that resistance was futile. 47 species had submitted because they understood this truth, but humans apparently hadn't gotten the message. Or perhaps they had gotten it and simply didn't care. Increase alert status, Crawthon ordered. All ships to battle stations 1 hour before system entry. I want full shields, weapons charged, and fighters ready to deploy. We treat this as a hostile engagement from the moment we exit hyperspace. Admiral, is that necessary? His second-in-command asked. They're a primitive species with inferior technology. They're a species that laughed at our ultimatum, Crawthon replied. A species that built doomsday weapons before they left their planet. A species whose entire culture is built around refusing to quit. Yes, it's necessary. We'll show them overwhelming force and end this quickly. No showboating, no demonstrations. We jump in, destroy their fleet, and pacify the colonies before they can organize any kind of prolonged resistance. He returned to his command chair and pulled up the tactical data on human ship positions. The humans had concentrated their fleet in a loose formation around their colony worlds. No defensive stations. No minefields. No obvious tactical advantages. It looked like they were just waiting to die. Crawthon frowned. That didn't match the profile of a species too stubborn to surrender. What were they planning? 6 hours until we find out, he muttered to himself. 6 hours until we see if the intelligence division is right to be worried. Around him, the 7th Pacification Fleet continued its inexorable advance through hyperspace. 300 warships that had never known defeat, carrying weapons that had shattered planets and broken civilizations. More than enough force to crush any resistance. Crawthon hoped it would be enough. Because if the intelligence report was right, If humans really were too stubborn to know when they were beaten, this wasn't going to be a quick pacification. It was going to be a war. And the sovereignty hadn't fought a real war in over 1,000 years. The humans, on the other hand, had apparently never stopped. The 7th Pacification Fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, 300 warships appearing simultaneously in the Kepler system like a swarm of metal locusts. On the bridge of the Times Eternal Victory *, Fleet Admiral Crothon watched his tactical display light up with contact markers as sensors swept the system. "Report," he ordered. "Human fleet detected," his tactical officer Zizix announced. 73 vessels confirmed. Composition matches intelligence estimates. 28 destroyers, 31 frigates, 9 cruisers, and 5 dreadnoughts. They're distributed across the inner system in what appears to be a defensive formation. Crothon studied the display. The human ships were scattered across an enormous volume of space, light seconds apart from each other. It made no tactical sense. Ships that far apart couldn't support each other, couldn't concentrate fire, couldn't coordinate maneuvers effectively. It looked less like a military formation and more like random placement. "Are they running?" Crothon asked. "Negative, Admiral. All human vessels have ceased acceleration. They're holding position." Zix's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "The formation is unusual. It violates standard tactical doctrine for defensive operations. They're amateurs," Crothon's second-in-command said dismissively. "They've been in space for less than a century. They probably don't even understand proper fleet tactics." Crothon wasn't so sure. He remembered the intelligence report. The warnings about human unpredictability. Communications. Open a channel to the human fleet. Give them one final chance to surrender. The communications officer worked for a moment, then nodded. "Channel open, Admiral." "Human forces," Crothon broadcast. "This is Fleet Admiral Crothon of the Galactic Sovereignty 7th Pacification Fleet. You are outnumbered 4-1. Your technology is inferior. Your position is indefensible. Surrender now and your crews will be treated according to sovereignty law. Resist and you will be destroyed. You have 5 minutes to respond." The tactical display showed no change. The human ships remained in their scattered positions, unmoving. 4 minutes passed in silence. Then, with only seconds remaining in the ultimatum, a response came through. "Admiral Crothon, this is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Fleet." The voice was female, calm, and carried a hint of amusement. "We received your surrender offer and discussed it with our crews. The consensus was unanimous. Our response is, come and get us." Then, the human ships opened fire. The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. Human vessels launching missiles from distances the Sovereignty had thought safe. Crothon barely had time to shout, "Evasive action," to 5. Quote, before the first impacts registered on his shields. But these weren't normal missiles. Sovereignty sensors detected the incoming ordnance and defensive systems automatically engaged, firing interceptor pulses designed to detonate missiles at safe distances. The interceptors worked perfectly, destroying the first wave of missiles. Then the missile debris kept coming. What the sensors had read as single missiles were actually clusters, outer casings protecting smaller warheads inside. When the interceptors destroyed the outer shells, they released dozens of smaller missiles that continued toward their targets. "Shields holding," the defensive officer reported. "But Admiral, those weapons are adapting. Each wave is slightly different. They're learning from our countermeasures." Crothon felt the first stirring of concern. Adaptive weapons required sophisticated computer systems and flexible programming. This wasn't primitive technology. Return fire. Target the nearest human vessel. Full power. The Times Eternal Victory *''s main plasma cannons swiveled toward a human frigate drifting 20,000 kilometers away. The weapons charged, building up the massive energy required for a ship-killing shot. 12 seconds later, they fired. 3 beams of blue-white plasma lanced across space, each carrying enough energy to vaporize a small mountain. The human frigate's shields flared and collapsed under the assault. Plasma burned through the hull. Explosions rippling across the ship's surface. Atmosphere vented from multiple breaches. Fires visible through ruptured sections. By all logic, the ship should have been dead. Instead, it rotated on thrusters and fired its main railgun. The magnetic acceleration was visible on sensors, a massive spike of electromagnetic energy as the railgun hurled a tungsten slug at relativistic velocity. The projectile crossed the distance in under 2 seconds, too fast for shields to fully respond. It punched through the Time's Eternal Victory **'s forward shields and slammed into the hull, penetrating 3 decks before its kinetic energy was finally absorbed. Alarms blared across the bridge. "Hull breach, decks 7 through 9, the damage control officer reported. "Emergency bulkheads sealed. 15 casualties." Crothon stared at the tactical display in disbelief. The human frigate was still fighting. Half its hull was breached. Fires burned throughout its structure. And it had to be losing atmosphere by the second, but it kept firing. As he watched, the frigate launched another salvo of missiles before finally going dark, its power core failing. "Admiral, multiple contacts," Zeeks shouted. "Human ships are accelerating. All of them simultaneously." The tactical display erupted with motion. Every human vessel, from the smallest frigate to the massive dreadnoughts, suddenly accelerated at rates that made Crothon's scales itch. 7, 8, 9 gravities of acceleration. No species could survive those forces without special compensation technology, and the intelligence report said human compensation systems were primitive. "How are their crews surviving those accelerations?" his second-in-command demanded. "They're probably not," Zex replied grimly. "Or they're using chemical enhancement." Intelligence reports mentioned human pilots sometimes used drugs to tolerate higher G-forces during training exercises. The human ships weren't just accelerating, they were accelerating in seemingly random directions. Some dove toward the inner system, others arced out toward the fleet's flanks, still others climbed above the plane of engagement. The scattered formation that had made no sense suddenly revealed its purpose. The humans had positioned their ships to create a 3-dimensional kill zone. And now, they were collapsing it on the Sovereignty fleet from all directions. "It's a trap," Crothon realized. "Evasive maneuvers. All ships scatter formation, but 300 ships couldn't scatter instantly." The fleet had entered the system in tight formation, expecting to overwhelm an inferior force with concentrated firepower. Now, that formation was a liability. Human ships dove through gaps in their defense, firing railguns at point-blank range. Human missiles, programmed to think independently, curved around interceptor fire and struck from unexpected angles. A human destroyer, already trailing debris and atmosphere, deliberately rammed a Sovereignty cruiser. The collision was catastrophic for both ships. But before the destroyer broke apart completely, Crothon saw escape pods launching. The crew had evacuated, but they hadn't evacuated far. They were wearing some kind of powered armor, continuing to fight in the vacuum of space with personal weapons. "Are those infantry?" Zeeks asked in disbelief. "Are they fighting as infantry? In space?" "Apparently," Crothon growled. He watched as the armored humans attached themselves to the damaged Sovereignty cruiser with magnetic boots and began cutting through the hull with some kind of laser torches. "They're boarding. They're actually trying to board our ships in the middle of a fleet battle." More alarms sounded as the engagement devolved into chaos. The Sovereignty fleet's advantages in range and firepower meant nothing when human ships closed to knife-fighting distance. Railgun slugs tore through shields that were designed to stop energy weapons. Human missiles proved disturbingly intelligent, some deliberately missing their targets only to loop back around for another attack pass. "Shield emitter 4 is down," the defensive officer reported. "The human missiles are targeting our shield generators specifically. They're analyzing our defensive emissions and striking weak points. Crothon felt the deck shudder as another railgun slug impacted the Time's eternal victory asterisk. The humans were fighting like nothing he'd ever encountered. They took horrific damage and kept fighting. He watched a human cruiser lose its entire forward section to plasma fire, the ship literally breaking in half. But the aft section continued to fight, its remaining weapons firing until the power finally failed. "Casualties?" he demanded. "Fleet-wide, Admiral. We've lost 43 ships destroyed, 71 damaged," Zeeks reported. His mandibles were clicking rapidly, a sign of stress. "Human losses are 31 destroyed, 20 damaged." "But Admiral, the damaged human ships are still fighting. Our damaged vessels are withdrawing, according to protocol. But the humans are not." "What do you mean they're still fighting?" Crothon asked. "If a ship is damaged, it withdraws for repairs. Human doctrine appears different," Zeke said. He pulled up footage from the battle. "Watch this." The display showed a human destroyer that had lost its shields, suffered multiple hull breaches, and was venting atmosphere from at least 6 major ruptures. According to sovereignty protocols, such a vessel should withdraw immediately. Instead, the destroyer was conducting evasive maneuvers while continuing to fire all functional weapons. As they watched, a plasma beam struck the ship's engineering section. The destroyer's power output flickered, but didn't fail. "They're operating on emergency power," Ziegs explained. "Multiple redundant systems. Even catastrophic damage doesn't disable them immediately, and their crews are fighting in damaged sections, sealing breaches manually, rerouting power, repairing systems in real time during combat." Another explosion rocked the Time's eternal victory asterisk. Crothon gripped his command chair as the ship shook. "Damage report. Damage report. Direct hit to starboard weapons array," the tactical officer reported. "Plasma cannons 3 through 7 are offline. We've got fires on multiple decks. Damage control teams are responding." Crothon made a decision he'd never made in 200 years of service. "All ships, execute tactical withdrawal. Fall back to outer system. Reform at Rally Point Delta." "Admiral?" His second-in-command looked shocked. "We're regrouping," Crothon snapped. But, even as he said it, he knew what it really was. The 7th Pacification Fleet, which had never retreated in its 1,000-year history, was running from a technologically inferior force. The human fleet didn't pursue. They couldn't. Most of their ships were barely functional, trailing debris and atmosphere. As the sovereignty ships accelerated away, Crothon got a final count of the damage. 43 sovereignty vessels destroyed, 71 damaged. Over 30,000 dead. The humans had lost 31 ships, but they'd made the sovereignty pay dearly for each one. "They fought like demons," Ziggs said quietly. "No regard for their own survival. No concern for acceptable losses. They just kept coming." Crothon stared at the tactical display, watching the battered human fleet slowly regrouping around their colony worlds. The intelligence report had been right. Humans didn't fight like other species. They didn't calculate odds or consider cost-benefit analysis. They just fought, with a determination that bordered on insanity. "Communications," Crothon ordered, his voice heavy. "Send a priority message to the Sovereignty Council. Tell them we engaged the human fleet. Tell them we were forced to withdraw. Tell them." He paused, the words bitter in his mouth. "Tell them we need reinforcements. The 7th Fleet alone is not sufficient to pacify the humans." As the message was transmitted, Crothon thought about Harold Zephinus's report. The humans had laughed when threatened with annihilation. Now he understood why. They weren't laughing because they thought they could win. They were laughing because they didn't care about the odds. They were going to fight anyway. And somewhere in the back of Crothon's mind, a disturbing question emerged. What would it take to make a species like this surrender? What force would be sufficient to break the will of beings who built weapons to destroy their own planet? Who fought with broken ships and dying crews? Who turned retreat into attack and turned certain defeat into bloody stalemate? He didn't know the answer. But he knew the sovereignty was about to find out. The Sovereignty Council chamber was a place of crystalline beauty, walls made of materials from 100 worlds reflecting light in patterns that most species found mesmerizing. Today, however, the beauty was lost on the assembled representatives. They sat in tense silence, watching the battle recordings from the Kepler system for the third time. Supreme Coordinator Velshar, a being of pure energy contained within a magnetic field, spoke first. Explain to me how the 7th Pacification Fleet, the most decorated military force in sovereignty history, was forced to retreat by a species that has barely mastered interstellar travel. Fleet Admiral Krathon stood before the council, his scales darker than usual with stress. The humans fought, unlike any enemy we have encountered. They showed no concern for casualties, no respect for tactical doctrine, and no inclination to surrender, even when facing certain destruction. That is not an explanation, Velshar replied coldly. That is an excuse. With respect, Supreme Coordinator, I disagree. Krathon activated the holographic display, showing the battle from multiple angles. Watch this engagement. A human destroyer, already critically damaged, rams one of our cruisers. This is not desperation. It's doctrine. They train for this. Their ships are designed with reinforced prows specifically for ramming attacks. Barbaric, one of the council members muttered. Effective, Krathon corrected. And here, watch this human frigate. It takes a direct hit from our most powerful plasma weapons. Hull breached, life support failing, power systems critically damaged. Any rational crew would evacuate. Instead, they seal the breached sections and continue fighting for another 7 minutes before their reactor finally fails. The council watched in silence. The recordings showed human ships fighting under conditions that should have left them dead or disabled. Ships with half their hulls missing still fired weapons. Crews worked in vacuum-sealed compartments, manually operating systems that should have been automated. One particularly disturbing clip showed human soldiers in powered armor fighting on the hull of their own ship, using handheld weapons against sovereignty fighters. They fight in space, Velshar observed, as infantry. Without ships. Yes, Krathon confirmed. They call it extravehicular combat. Our intelligence division has discovered they've been developing these tactics for years, anticipating close-quarters space battles. They have weapons designed specifically for vacuum fighting, armor that doubles as spacecraft, and training protocols for zero-gravity combat. Another council member, a gas form being named Tethys, swirled forward. The casualty reports show we destroyed nearly half their fleet. Surely they must realize continued resistance is futile. Krathon shook his head. Our intelligence suggests otherwise. We've intercepted human communications. Would the council like to hear them? Velshar gestured assent. Krathon activated an audio file. A human voice filled the chamber, speaking in what the translator rendered as casual, almost cheerful tones. This is Captain Rodriguez of the TDF, indomitable to all ships. We just rammed a sovereignty battlecruiser and lived to tell about it. The aliens didn't think we were crazy enough to try. They were wrong. Humanity sends its regards. Another voice followed. This one female. This is Admiral Chen. All ships, the sovereignty fleet is withdrawing. I repeat, they're running. We hurt them. We made them bleed. This is just the beginning. Hold your positions, repair what you can, and get ready for round 2. Earth stands. The colonies stand. Humanity stands. The final clip was from a general broadcast, apparently sent to all human colonies. A man with gray hair and a stern expression spoke directly to the camera. To all human citizens throughout known space. Today, the Terran Defense Fleet engaged the Galactic Sovereignty's 7th Pacification Fleet. We were outnumbered 4-1. We were technologically inferior. By every reasonable calculation, we should have been annihilated. Instead, we forced them to retreat. Yes, we took losses. Yes, we have wounded. Yes, some of our ships are barely functional. But we're still here. We're still fighting. The sovereignty thought we would kneel. They were wrong. They thought we would surrender. They were wrong. They thought we were just another weak species to be dominated. They were wrong about that too. We are humans. We don't surrender. We adapt. We overcome. And we win by refusing to lose. The recording ended. The council chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then Velshar spoke, his energy field flickering with agitation. They're treating this as a victory. They lost nearly half their fleet, and they're celebrating. Not celebrating, Crothon corrected. Defying. There's a difference. They know they're outmatched. They know more sovereignty ships will come, but they're choosing to fight anyway. And what's worse, they're broadcasting this defiance to every corner of their space, every colony, every ship, every citizen is hearing the same message. Humanity fought the sovereignty and didn't lose, but they did lose, Tethys insisted. Mathematically, strategically, they lost. They survived, Crothon said quietly. For humans, that appears to be the same thing as winning. The council debated for hours. Some argued for immediate escalation, sending the Grand Armada to crush humanity once and for all. Others suggested diplomatic solutions, attempting to negotiate from a position of strength. A few even proposed leaving humanity alone, designating their space as restricted territory and avoiding further conflict. While the Sovereignty Council argued, Admiral Sarah Chen sat in the makeshift command center on the colony world of New Terra. The battle had left her flagship, the Times Defiant Horizon Asterisk, heavily damaged, so she'd transferred operations planet-side. Around her, officers worked frantically to coordinate repairs, redistribute supplies, and prepare for the next engagement. Commander Rodriguez entered carrying a data pad. Admiral, we've completed the damage assessment. It's not good. Free. Give me the numbers, Chen said. 31 ships destroyed, 22 damaged beyond field repair. Of our remaining ships, only 15 are combat-ready without major repairs. We lost over 8,000 crew members. Our missile stocks are at 40%, railgun ammunition at 60%, and our shipyards are already at maximum capacity, trying to repair what we can. Chen nodded slowly. She'd expected as much. And the Sovereignty fleet? Long-range sensors tracked them to the outer system. They're holding position, probably waiting for reinforcements. Our intelligence suggests they took significant damage. At least 40 ships destroyed, many more damaged. But, Admiral, Rodriguez hesitated. They have 300 ships. Even after losses, they outnumber us 3-1. And there are reports of more sovereignty forces being mobilized throughout the sector. I know, Chen said. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the colony below. New Terra was a young world. Barely 20 years old, 15 million people called it home. People who had traveled across light years to build something new. She could see the city lights, the agricultural domes, the mining operations in the distance. All of it would be destroyed if the Sovereignty won. We can't beat them, Rodriguez said quietly. Not in a straight fight. We got lucky this time. They underestimated us, and we used tactics they'd never seen before. But next time, they'll be ready. Then we need to make sure there isn't a next time, Chen replied. Or rather, we need to make sure the next time happens on our terms. She turned back to the tactical display showing the entire sector. Execute Operation Checkmate. It's time to change the rules of this game. Operation Checkmate had been planned months ago, back when humanity first detected signs of the Sovereignty's existence. It was a contingency plan, something to try only in desperate circumstances. Chen had hoped they'd never need it. But desperate circumstances had arrived. Over the next 72 hours, Human stealth ships, small vessels designed for reconnaissance and covert operations, slipped past the sovereignty blockade. They traveled to dozens of systems throughout the sector. Systems that the sovereignty controlled but didn't inhabit heavily. These were vassal worlds, species that had surrendered to sovereignty authority decades or centuries ago. The stealth ships didn't attack. They didn't invade. They simply broadcast a message to all species living under sovereignty rule. This is a message from humanity. We are currently at war with the galactic sovereignty. They demanded we surrender, accept vassal status, and give up our worlds. We refused. They sent their 7th pacification fleet, 300 warships, to force our compliance. We fought them. We made them bleed. We made them retreat. We're not telling you this to brag. We're telling you this to prove something. The sovereignty can be fought. They can be hurt. They can be beaten. We know many of you have been under their control for generations. We know you were forced to accept vassal status because resistance seemed impossible. We're here to tell you it's not impossible. We're fighting. If you want to fight too, fight. If you want to resist, resist. If you just want to watch, watch. But know this: humanity is not surrendering. We're proving that defiance is possible. What you do with that information is up to you. The message spread like wildfire. Within days, the first reports of unrest reached the Sovereignty Council. A mining colony in the Turthan system had stopped shipments to sovereignty worlds. A manufacturing center in the Quellis system had suffered mysterious equipment failures. A vassal species, called the Kelthans, had formally requested renegotiation of their treaty status. It was just the beginning. The sovereignty had maintained control through the perception of invincibility. They were the supreme power. Resistance was futile. Compliance was inevitable. Humanity had shattered that perception. One small species, fighting against impossible odds, had forced the mighty 7th Fleet to retreat. If humans could do it, maybe others could too. Back on the Time's Eternal Victory *, Fleet Admiral Crothon read the reports of growing unrest with mounting dread. "They're not just fighting us," he told Zizix. "They're undermining the entire foundation of sovereignty control." "The Council is furious," Ziggs reported. "They're mobilizing the Grand Armada. 3,000 ships. They're going to crush humanity and make an example of them." Crothon looked at the tactical display showing human space. Such a small region. Really. A few dozen systems. A few 100 million beings. Against the full might of the sovereignty, they had no chance. But a nagging doubt gnawed at him. The humans had to know this. They had to understand they couldn't win a war of annihilation against a force that controlled thousands of worlds. So why were they still fighting? Why were they broadcasting messages of defiance? Why were they encouraging other species to resist? Unless they weren't trying to win the war. Unless they were trying to win something else entirely. They were trying to break the sovereignty's control by proving it could be broken. They were fighting not to achieve victory, but to inspire rebellion. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was the most dangerous thing Crothon had ever encountered. Because even if the sovereignty destroyed humanity completely, the damage was done. The message was out. The perception of invincibility was shattered. "How long until the Grand Armada arrives?" Crothon asked. 4 weeks, Zix replied. 4 weeks, Crothon repeated. 4 weeks for humanity to prepare. 4 weeks for their message to spread further. 4 weeks for more vassal species to start questioning their status. 4 weeks for the sovereignty's carefully maintained order to continue unraveling. He wondered what the humans would do with that time. Knowing them, something unexpected, something dangerous, something that would make the coming battle even more complicated than it already was. "Prepare the fleet," Crothon ordered. "When the Grand Armada arrives, we'll need to be ready for anything." Because if there was one thing he'd learned about humans, it was that they were never predictable. And they never, ever gave up. The Grand Armada of the Galactic Sovereignty emerged from hyperspace like a wall of metal and light. 3,000 warships, representing the combined military might of a dozen species, and hundreds of worlds. They filled the space around Earth's solar system with their presence. A show of force, unprecedented in recent sovereignty history. On the bridge of the Super Dreadnought Times Absolute Authority *, Supreme Fleet Commander Xelnoth watched the tactical displays with satisfaction. The commander was a member of the Aelthar species, beings of pure thought given form through technology. Xelnoth had existed for over 500 years, and had commanded fleets for 300 of them. This would be the greatest victory of a long and distinguished career. Human fleet positions? Xelnoth asked. The question transmitted directly from thought to the ship's communication systems. The humans have concentrated their entire remaining fleet around Earth and Mars, the tactical officer reported. 147 vessels detected. They've been reinforced since the Kepler engagement. Xelnoth observed the human formation with interest. The humans had positioned their fleet in defensive layers around their homeworld. It was a conventional strategy, one that made tactical sense. Protect the core. Make the enemy pay for every inch of space they took. It would be ineffective against overwhelming force, but it showed the humans had learned something about proper military doctrine. Open all channels, Xelnoth commanded. I will address the humans directly. Within seconds, every communication device in the solar system received the broadcast. Every human ship, every space station, every colony on Mars and the outer planets, even personal devices on Earth itself. Humans of Earth. Xelnoth's voice echoed across the void. This is Supreme Fleet Commander Xelnoth of the Galactic Sovereignty. You see before you 3,000 warships, the largest fleet assembled in recent history. We come with a simple message. Your defiance ends today. You will surrender immediately, or we will destroy your homeworld. You have proven yourselves to be brave warriors. The sovereignty respects this. But bravery without wisdom is merely foolishness. Surrender now, and you will be granted vassal status with favorable terms. Continue to resist, and Earth itself will burn. You have 1 hour to respond. On the surface of Earth, in the rebuilt military command center in Geneva, Admiral Sarah Chen watched the armada through long-range sensors. Around her, the command staff worked quietly. Each person focused on their task, despite the overwhelming force hanging in space above them. They mean it, Commander Rodriguez said quietly. 3,000 ships. Admiral, we can't fight that. Nobody could. Chen didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about the past 4 weeks, the frantic preparations humanity had made. Every ship that could fly had been rushed into service. Every weapon that could shoot had been mounted. Every person who could fight had volunteered. They'd managed to rebuild their fleet to 147 ships, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But humanity hadn't spent the past 4 weeks just building ships. Status on Operation Checkmate? Chen asked. 15 vassal species have formally declared independence from the sovereignty, reported the intelligence officer. 23 more are in active rebellion. The sovereignty is dealing with uprisings across 3 entire sectors. Their supply lines are compromised, and they've had to divert ships to maintain order. And our special project? The intelligence officer smiled grimly. Complete. All units are in position. Chen nodded slowly. She looked at the countdown timer. 45 minutes remained. She opened a communication channel, not to Xelnoth, but to every human ship, every station, every person who had stayed to fight. This is Admiral Chen. You all know what we're facing. 3,000 ships against our 147. The sovereignty thinks those numbers mean they've already won. They think we'll surrender because fighting is illogical. They don't understand us at all. We're the species that split the atom, that walked on our own moon with computers less powerful than a calculator, that survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. We're the species that looked at impossible odds and said, challenge accepted. The sovereignty wants us to kneel. My response is the same as it was at Kepler. Come and get us. She closed the channel and turned to Rodriguez. Execute final phase. All ships to battle stations. Activate the network. In the outer solar system, beyond the orbit of Neptune, something stirred. Objects that had been drifting in the cold darkness for weeks suddenly powered up. They were small, barely larger than a human, shaped like elongated cylinders. There were thousands of them, hidden throughout the Oort cloud, invisible to sovereignty sensors among the countless chunks of ice and rock. They were relativistic kill vehicles. Missiles accelerated over weeks to 90% of the speed of light. At that velocity, even a small object carried kinetic energy equivalent to multiple nuclear weapons. And they'd been aimed at specific coordinates, calculated positions where the Grand Armada would emerge from hyperspace. Fire, Chen ordered. The network activated. Thousands of kill vehicles, already traveling at relativistic speeds, made final course corrections and accelerated toward the sovereignty fleet. At 90% light speed, they would reach their targets in minutes. And at that velocity, they couldn't be stopped, dodged, or intercepted. Physics simply didn't allow it. On the Times Absolute Authority asterisk, alarms suddenly screamed across every system. Commander, we're detecting massive kinetic signatures, thousands of objects incoming at relativistic velocities. Zelnoth's consciousness expanded rapidly, processing the threat. The outer system, Commander. They were already in motion when we arrived. We couldn't detect them because their velocity made them effectively invisible until they were close enough to register on sensors. Time to impact? 3 minutes, Commander. 3 minutes. Not enough time to move 3,000 ships. Not enough time to charge weapons. Not enough time to do anything except watch death approach at a significant fraction of light speed. All ships, emergency evasive action. Maximum thrust, random vectors. Zelnoth broadcast. Some ships would survive. Enough ships would survive. Some parent. The humans couldn't have that many relativistic weapons. But the humans had spent 4 weeks building them, 4 weeks accelerating them, 4 weeks aiming them. And humans, as the sovereignty was learning, were very good at building weapons. The first impacts came like the hammer of an angry god. A single kill vehicle, traveling at 90% of light speed, struck a sovereignty battleship. The kinetic energy was so massive that the battleship simply ceased to exist, converted instantly to plasma and shrapnel. The explosion was visible from Earth. A brief new star in the sky. Then another impact. And another. And another. The kill vehicles had been programmed to seek the largest targets, the capital ships, and super dreadnoughts that formed the core of the sovereignty fleet. They struck with unstoppable force, each impact destroying or crippling a ship that represented decades of construction and thousands of crew members. The Grand Armada scattered, ships fleeing in all directions, desperate to avoid the relativistic bombardment. In 15 minutes, the perfectly organized formation became chaos. 200 ships were destroyed outright. 300 more were damaged. The rest were scattered across the inner solar system. Formation broken, coordination shattered. And then the human fleet attacked. 147 ships against what remained of 3,000 sounded impossible. But the sovereignty ships were scattered, damaged, and demoralized. The humans struck in coordinated groups, targeting isolated ships, using the same brutal close-quarters tactics they'd employed at Kepler. Railguns, fired at point-blank range. Missiles pursued fleeing ships. Human vessels, already damaged from previous battles, threw themselves at sovereignty ships with suicidal determination. The Times Defiant Horizon asterisk, Admiral Chen's flagship, was one of the most damaged ships in the fleet. The battle at Kepler had left her with hull breaches across 3 decks, 1 engine destroyed, and shields operating at 40% capacity. She'd been patched together in field repairs, held together by welds and determination. Chen stood on the bridge, which was partially open to vacuum on one side, forcing the crew to work in pressure suits. Target the Sovereignty command ship. All weapons, full power. Admiral, our shields are failing, the defensive officer reported. One more hit, and we'll have multiple hull breaches. Then we'd better hit them first, Chen replied. The Times' defiant horizon times accelerated directly toward the Times' absolute authority asterisk, ignoring the plasma fire that tore at her weakened shields. The flagship's railguns fired in sequence, each shot sending a tungsten slug screaming toward the Sovereignty super-dreadnought. The slugs punched through shields and hull, penetrating deep into the massive vessel. "Shields down!" the defensive officer shouted. Multiple impacts on decks 4 through 7. Chen felt the ship shudder as plasma fire struck home. Alarms blared. Emergency bulkheads sealed. Atmosphere vented from breached sections. The ship was dying around her. But they were still flying, still fighting. "Fire all remaining missiles," Chen ordered. "Target their bridge." 43 missiles launched from the Times' defiant horizon asterisk, the last of her ammunition. They curved through space, adapting to countermeasures, seeking the specific coordinates Chen had designated. Most were destroyed by Sovereignty defensive systems. 7 got through. The missiles struck the Times' absolute authority asterisk's command deck in a cascade of explosions. The super dreadnought's shields flared and collapsed. The bridge, where Supreme Fleet Commander Zelnoth had stood moments before, became a crater of molten metal and shattered technology. "Sovereignty command ship is disabled," Rodriguez shouted. "They're venting atmosphere and losing power." Chen allowed herself a small smile, but it faded quickly as new damage reports flooded in. The Times' defiant horizon times was falling apart. Life support was failing on 12 decks. Main power was at 15%. The ship's structural integrity was compromised to the point where any significant maneuver might break her spine. "Admiral, we need to evacuate," Rodriguez said urgently. "The ship won't survive another hit." No, Chen said firmly. "Not yet. Broadcast the message. All channels." The communications officer, working from a backup station because the main console had been destroyed, nodded and opened every frequency. "To every species listening." Chen's voice echoed across the solar system. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Fleet. This is how you say no to tyranny. This is how you fight for your freedom. You don't surrender because the odds are bad. You don't quit because victory seems impossible. You fight until your ship breaks. Then, you fight in the wreckage. You fight until you can't fight anymore. And even then, you don't give up, because freedom isn't given, it's taken. Peace isn't granted, it's earned. And dignity isn't bestowed, it's claimed." She paused, watching the tactical display. The battle was still raging, but something had changed. Sovereignty ships were retreating. Not in an organized withdrawal, but in panicked flight. They'd come expecting to crush a primitive species. Instead, they'd been bloodied, their command structure shattered, their invincible fleet proven vulnerable. "We didn't start this war," Chen continued. "The Sovereignty did when they demanded we kneel. We're finishing it by refusing to fall. To all vassal species, to all beings living under Sovereignty control. You see what we've done. We're not special. We're not superior. We're just stubborn enough to fight for what's ours. If we can do it, you can do it." The transmission ended. Chen turned to Rodriguez. "Now we can evacuate." The crew of the Times, defiant horizon times, abandoned ship in an orderly evacuation, moving through damaged corridors in pressure suits, helping wounded crew members, carrying what equipment they could. Chen was the last to leave, standing on the shattered bridge as her ship groaned and buckled around her. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the ship. Then she activated her suit's thrusters and pushed away from the dying vessel. Behind her, the Times' defiant horizon times finally broke apart, the structural damage too severe to sustain. The ship split in 3 sections, each piece tumbling slowly through space, a monument to stubborn defiance. The Battle of Earth lasted 6 more hours. When it finally ended, the Sovereignty fleet had retreated, leaving behind 500 destroyed ships and thousands of dead. The human fleet was reduced to 43 functional vessels. Earth itself had taken damage from debris and missed shots, though the planet's defenses had prevented any direct attacks on the surface. But humanity had survived. Against overwhelming odds, facing the largest fleet in Sovereignty history, they'd survived. 3 days later, an official transmission arrived from the Sovereignty Council. It was not an ultimatum. It was a request for negotiation. The Treaty of Terra was signed 4 weeks later. It recognized humanity as an independent power, established mutual borders, and most importantly, acknowledged humanity's right to self-determination. The Sovereignty didn't call it a surrender, but everyone knew what it was. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Galactic Sovereignty had accepted peace terms from a position of weakness. The treaty had wider implications. Within a year, 15 vassal species had negotiated independence. 20 more had gained increased autonomy. The Sovereignty's absolute control had been broken, not by a stronger power, but by the simple proof that they could be resisted. 6 months after the treaty, Admiral Chen stood in a memorial park on Earth, looking at a monument made from salvaged metal from the Time's Defiant Horizon asterisk. It was a simple structure, listing the names of every person who had died in the war. Over 30,000 names. Too many names. A young officer approached, saluting. "Admiral Chen, I'm Lieutenant Morrison. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" Chen asked. "For not surrendering," Morrison replied. "My parents were on one of the colony worlds the Sovereignty demanded as tribute. If you'd given in, I would have grown up as a vassal. Instead, I grew up free." Chen smiled tiredly. "We didn't win. You know, we lost ships, people, resources. By any reasonable measure, we lost. But we survived," Morrison said. "Isn't that the same thing for humans?" Chen looked at the memorial, at the thousands of names carved in metal from a ship that had fought until it broke. She thought about all the people who had refused to kneel, who had fought against impossible odds, who had changed the course of galactic history simply by being too stubborn to quit. "Yes," she said finally. "For humans, that's exactly the same thing." Above them, in the orbital shipyards, new vessels were being constructed. Larger, more advanced, incorporating lessons learned from the war. The shipyards worked day and night, building humanity's future. Because the treaty had brought peace. But peace required strength to maintain. The Galactic Sovereignty had issued a warning. The human fleet had laughed in defiance. And in doing so, humanity had changed the galaxy forever. They'd proven that defiance was possible, that resistance could succeed, that the will to fight mattered more than the odds of winning. Other species would remember that lesson. The Sovereignty would remember too. And they would never again make the mistake of thinking humanity would simply surrender. Because surrender was logical. Because humans, as the galaxy had learned, weren't logical. They were stubborn, determined, and too spite-driven to acknowledge when they were beaten. And sometimes, that was enough to change everything.